We'll go ahead and begin our notes. Okay, so you can title your notes, Introduction to the Parables of Jesus. Okay, so we'll start number one. What's the definition of a parable? Probably good to define the parable, seeing as that was one of our objectives. What is it? How do we define it? There's been fancy terms and all of that people have used it because I suppose that other people throughout time like the way that those words are put together, and so they... But let's start by talking about what a parable is not. All right? 1, 2, 3, 4. Okay, 4 things that a parable is not. All right? And this is kind of getting into literature because it is liturgical by nature. But if you open to 2 Peter 1:16, or just listen, there the Bible says, "For we have not followed cunningly devised fables." So there is a word that Peter uses there, and he uses the word fable. All right? Is a parable a fable? The answer is no. Okay, so one of the things that a parable is not is it is not a fable. All right, so what is a fable? The fable it does give truth, but it never rises above the earthly or moral application. So you got Aesop's fables, right? The famous thing there. So he deals with animals, and a lot of times, right? The fox and the hare, was it the rabbit and the hare, the turtle and the hare and the turtle, and they're racing and all that. So I'm sure there's a rabbit and a snail or something somewhere, but he uses animals, but never really rises above that. So the teaching there is moral teaching, but it's moral teaching and interaction between people. Okay, so it can be applied that way. But normally, fables don't rise above that. Normally, it doesn't have a spiritual application. Parables, on the other hand, do. Therefore, a parable is not a fable. So the parable differs from the fable in that it contains both. Now, there is an earthly setting to it, but then there's a spiritual, rises above the earthly thing, and it gets into the moral spiritual aspect of it. So a fable is an imperfect vehicle for imparting spiritual truth because it doesn't rise above that. Okay, it can teach us how we can be good to one another and so forth, and wisdom regarding not procrastinating and so forth. But it normally doesn't rise above that. There are some fables in the Bible, actually. We'll go to Judges chapter 9. We're not saying that fables are wicked. We're not saying that. We're just saying that a parable that the Lord chose to teach from is not a fable. Okay, what did I say? Judges 9. Okay, so let's read through this and keep in mind what I just said about a fable as we look at this. Beginning in verse 8. The trees went forth. You can kind of imagine Aesop's fable here. The trees where was I? 9, 8. The trees went forth on a time to anoint a king over them. So you have a bunch of trees anointing a king. I don't know if you know this, but typically trees don't do that. Nor does a turtle and a hare set up a racing thing with a finish line and all of that. The trees went forth at a time to anoint a king over them, and they said unto the olive tree, "Reign thou over us." So they wanted the olive tree to reign over them. But the olive tree said unto them, "Should I leave my fatness, wherewith by me they honor God and man, and go to be promoted over the trees? Should I do this?" You know that being fat is actually kind of a positive thing in the scriptures. The diligent man shall be fat, right? And the tree said unto the fig tree, "Come thou and reign over us." So they tried the olive tree, it didn't work, so they went to a fig tree. But the fig tree said unto them, when you hear the word fig, what do you think of? Newtons. I think of Newtons, I get immediately. That's the only fig that way. Okay. But the fig tree said unto them, "Should I forsake my sweetness and my good fruit and go to be promoted over the trees?" And so they're giving excuses. Then said the trees unto the vine, "Come thou and reign over us." And the vine said unto them, "Should I leave my wine, which cheereth God and man, and go to be promoted over the trees?" Then said all the trees unto the bramble, "Come thou and reign over us." And the bramble said unto the trees, "If in truth ye anoint me king over you, then come and put your trust in my shadow. And if not, let fire come out of the bramble and devour the cedars of Lebanon." Okay. So this is dealing with the anointing of a king, and they're trying to bring out the idea that to anoint a king, you should be wise and pick wisely. Sometimes the one that you pick is not the best one for you. I think you would agree that an olive tree or fig tree is better than a bramble. So, but that's the idea. It never really rises above that. Okay, it's a good teaching. The teaching is fine, but it never really rises above that. So this is an example of an Old Testament fable. In 2 Kings 14. And verse 9. And Jehoash, the king of Israel, make sure I get this right, 14:9, yep. And Jehoash, the king of Israel, said unto Amaziah, king of Judah, saying, the thistle that was in Lebanon sent unto the cedar that was in Lebanon, saying, give thy daughter to my son to wife. And there passed by a wild beast that was in Lebanon and trode down the thistle. Okay, so the beast didn't like it. So here's another, you have a thistle, you have a beast, and you have thistles and things talking to each other. This is a fable. All right. Normally, and sometimes fables are kind of fantastic in their teaching. In other words, obviously trees don't talk to each other. They don't reign over it. It doesn't happen. But there's a message in there. But it doesn't really rise above that. And these are examples of fables then. A parable is not a fable. Okay, so the fable sometimes jests a fable, and this is kind of the identification of a fable. Sometimes a fable jests and makes fun of situations. Okay, the situation could even be serious, and they make fun of it. Okay, it's a jesting a little bit, maybe making it a bit more lighthearted, so teaching could come through for whatever reason. And in the trials of men, so it makes it kind of a jest. A fable attributes reason and language to animals and trees, while a parable does not permit this sporting, if you will, with the truth. So if you know something about parables, normally the Lord talks about actual real-life situations. It isn't a fantasy. He doesn't teach in such a way where you have water talking to the sky or whatever. Okay. Again, nothing wrong with that sort of teaching, but that's not a parable. So we have to stay away from that with that understanding. Now, again, if we understand that, it will help us to, in our allegorical understanding that it's not, understanding what it is. Okay, so it's not a fable. Secondly, what a parable is not a myth. Whereas fables can be somewhat fantastic by nature, myths are even more so. A myth is rooted in something beyond fact or reason. So a myth really there isn't any scientific proof for a myth. You've heard of old wives' fables, right? So the famous one when I was growing up, your face is going to stay that way, right? So somehow if I make a bad face enough times, then there is no reversal in it and my face is going to stay that way. I thought it'd be a good skit. You have the old wives' tales, right? And so you come, somebody's got a messed up face and it doesn't change, that kind of thing, a 10-foot pole, all that. So while the parable is firmly rooted in something that is sound, and when the Lord taught in parables, it wasn't anything that people didn't understand. Right? The other day, my wife and I were at dinner and we were talking about what people said about child rearing, and they said there was one lady that told her, you cover the head of that baby because if you don't, it's going to get diarrhea. So if I don't cover the head, what in the world? Okay, whatever. All right, this is old wives' fables, myths. So I think we understand that. And it's not really rooted in any kind of truth at all. It's just a traditional story about people involving supernatural events. All right, so that's a myth. Parable is absolutely not a myth. It is also not a proverb. The words proverb and parable are sometimes used interchangeably. In Matthew 15, for example, 14 and 15, let them alone. They be blind leaders of the blind. If the blind lead the blind, both shall fall into the ditch. Then answered Peter and said unto him, declare unto us this parable. So he's giving a proverb. Sometimes they use interchangeably, proverb and parable, but they're not really the same thing. Both use a comparison to illustrate spiritual truth. But what's the difference then between a parable and a proverb? A proverb is normally short and concise, right? It doesn't really carry it out. So I think in terms of length, Proverbs is usually one statement, just a quick statement, where a proverb is normally carried through and it's a little bit longer. Okay, so it could be said maybe that a parable is kind of an expanded proverb or vice versa. Right? Now, and so it's not a fable, it's not a myth, it's not a proverb, and lastly, it is not an allegory. Now, this is going to be important. What is an allegory then? How can I tell the difference? An allegory blends that earthly illustration together with a greater meaning. Okay, what would be the famous allegory? I think the Pilgrim's Progress, right? That would definitely be an allegory. So what is sin pictured as in the Pilgrim's Progress is a big pack that Christian is carrying, right? So that's what it's pictured as. The author, is it John Bunyan? Am I right about that? That never really goes past that. He just kind of lets the reader be carried along in the allegory and doesn't really explain it. You assume and come to the understanding that that pack is sin, right? We know that. But he never really explains it, does he? He never goes past that. He kind of just carries you along in that, and then he's got different people that show up and talk to him, but he never really explains it. So an allegory is just strict symbolism and things, and it's just carried through with no real explanation. That's an allegory. So it doesn't really need an interpretation to understand it, but a parable does. Okay, because a parable can be taken maybe lots of different ways, and so there's a main idea that is to be brought out. And when we look at the reasons why the Lord taught in parables, then maybe be able better to understand that. Okay, so let's go to Isaiah chapter 5. We have an example here of an allegory. Isaiah 5, 1 through 6. Again, is there anything wicked about allegory? No, not really. But we have to understand when the Bible is talking about allegory and when it's not. Right, let's look at it and try to get this understanding. Now, some of these differences are subtle. But Isaiah 5, verse 1, "Now will I sing to my well-beloved the song of my beloved touching his vineyard. My well-beloved hath a vineyard and a very fruitful hill." Now, this isn't fantastic. There are vineyards, aren't they? Is this outside of reality? No, it's not. So it's not a myth. It's not a fable. "My well-beloved hath a vineyard and a very fruitful hill, and he fenced it and gathered out the stones thereof and planted it with the choicest vine, and built a tower in the midst of it, and also made a winepress therein. He looked that it should bring forth grapes, and it brought forth wild grapes." Is this outside of the realm of possibility? No, it's completely possible. "And now, O inhabitants of Jerusalem, men of Judah, judge, I pray you, betwixt me and my vineyard. What could have been done more to my vineyard that I have not done in it? Wherefore, when I looked that it should bring forth grapes, brought it forth wild grapes? And now go to, I will tell you what I will do to my vineyard. I will take away the hedge thereof, and it shall be eaten up, and break down the wall thereof, and it shall be trodden down. And I will lay it waste. It shall not be pruned nor digged, but there shall come up briars and thorns. I will also command the clouds that they rain no rain upon it. For the vineyard of the Lord of hosts is the house of Israel, and the men of Judah his pleasant plant. And he looked for judgment, and behold oppression, for righteousness, but woe, behold a cry. Woe unto them that join house to house," and so forth. Okay, so even verse 7, although he tells us what the vineyard is, does he really give an explanation of what wild grapes are? What are the wild grapes? What does that really mean? Okay, no, not really. The allegory then is just kind of, it sits there for us to, and it just kind of carries us along in it, okay? And then we have to not muddle through, but we have to be able to interpret and to understand the sense and the mind of the author. A parable is a bit different because a parable does give that explanation. There is a distinct explanation for it. And so a lot of the times the Lord asked for that explanation of his parables, and he gave it to him. He told him exactly what it is. The parable of the sower and the seed is a very good example. He says the sower is this, the seed is this. He designates exactly what it is. So the parable then is stories that are couched in real life situations, but the interpretation of what it is given. It requires an interpretation because it could be more than one thing, okay? So interpretation of these things are required. So a parable is not an allegory. It's not a fable. It's not a myth. And it's not a proverb. So what is it? Well, the Greek word, if you care to know, is pairoimia. You don't need to know that, but that's one of the words used in Greek for parable. In John 16:29, we see this word used. John 16:29, and his disciples said unto him, Lo now, speakest thou plainly, and speakest no proverb. That word proverb is pairoimia. Okay, is that Greek word. And so sometimes it's translated here proverb. John uses it in his writing. 2 Peter does. That the famous verse where a dog returning to his vomit. Now it says a proverb there. It's the same idea, same kind of word, same root. It says there, but it has happened unto them according to the true proverb. The dog is returned to his own vomit again, and the sow that was washed to her wallowing in the mire. All right. So that's a true proverb. So here we have a sow, and those may be proverbs, but this word is used then kind of interchangeably for that. And so what does it literally mean? This word means something by the way, something along the way. All right. Something by the way, or that which is by the way. Okay, so what is the symbolism there? Well, I think if you're going along, okay, and there's a main direction that you're headed, right? So I'm going to be allegorical in this explanation. So there's a main direction that you're headed, right? I'm headed this way. And along the way, you may look at something along the way. Now, I'm still headed this way, right? However, alongside here, there's something that's going to help me along the way. It's not going to redirect me, because it's very important you see this. It's not going to redirect me. It's going to help me along the way. So this is the idea, and the subtle nuances in Greek words helps us maybe to understand it a little bit more. But it's something by the way. All right, so this is the idea of parable. It's alongside something, an adage, something that's added to it to help us along the way. It's a figurative discourse by which contains more than meets the ear, okay, or more than meets the eye, if you will. Again, those are kind of proverbs, but there's more of a meaning behind it, but it helps us along the way in the same direction. There's another word, that's paroima, parabola. This is where parabola, or it's probably ola. Okay, I'm not totally sure about this. This is where we get parable from. All right, more literally, the transliteration of this word is our parable. You understand transliteration, where we make it sound like it does in this other language, but we use our own letters? Okay, that's a transliteration. So this is parabola, parable, all right? So this is used also, the parable, the vine and the branches. That would be another example of an allegory. All right, but this word parabola is used only in the synoptic Gospels. It's only used in Matthew, Mark, and Luke, which is why John uses more of an allegory. He doesn't really use this word. That's kind of an interesting thing. What does this mean? To throw or place side by side. This is what it means. To place, I'll just say to place, side by side. Let's explore that a little bit. To place side by side. Now, what does that invoke? What kind of image does that evoke in your mind? Nothing. I'm just writing notes down. To place side by side.
Two people walking on the same road.
Okay, what else?
Oxen.
Oxen.
I think of an allegory. Two stories.
Okay. Okay, compared to a straight, so comparison, right? Okay, that's a good word. You're comparing. When you place something side by side, what are you doing? You're comparing them. You're looking at the comparison. How is this the same as this? How is it different? So you seem to indicate a straight line, so there would be a standard, right? This is what we're talking about. So you're comparing it to a standard. That's the idea. You're placing it side by side. Does it measure up, right? We talk about that. Are there standards in measurement? Yes. In fact, I think for some reason it's mostly in France, but the metric system has its, there is a machine that measures exactly what 1 second is. And it measures the vibrations of a cesium atom. So how many times, how it can do it, I have no idea. But it measures how many times a cesium atom vibrates, and it is exactly that many times in exactly 1 second. So it chops it down to the very, 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 very milli nanosecond. That's exactly what it is. So that's a standard. Does my watch add up to that standard? Probably not. All right, or yours, I don't know. If you've got a Rolex, I don't know. Or a meter. They have something somewhere, this is exactly a meter. Now, it's in a controlled environment because they don't want it to expand or contract. So it's in a very, very controlled environment. This is exactly a meter. And all of that, they have a standard. So sometimes your measuring devices, would your tape measure a little bit differently in the summertime than it would in the wintertime? Actually, it does. Okay, so if you build your house in the winter, it's going to be slightly smaller than if you built it in the summertime. It's kind of odd, but it's true. Okay, because you've expanded and contracted. Okay, so, but this is what we're talking about, side by side. Okay, so let's make that, let's carry this over to parables. So when the Lord spoke in parables, he was teaching in such a way that this is the main teaching here, and I'm going to put something beside it, and I want you to compare it to that. Okay, that's kind of the idea. That's what the word parable means. So I think that's a good way to see it. All right, let's do some fancier definitions then. An utterance which involves a comparison. That's not too fancy. I guess we've already talked about it. Some people define a parable as an utterance, a saying, something that is said, which involves a comparison. This has the idea of side by side. Now, what is the common definition? A man by the name of Taylor, in his book Parables of Our Savior, in 1886, defined it this way: an earthly story with a heavenly meaning. How many have heard that before? Okay, all of us have. All right, so that was in the late 19th century that came about, and it's kind of stuck. And it does define things pretty well, maybe somewhat limited, and is very sketchy and skeletal at best, but it does define things. Okay, so that's what it is. All right. Now, why did the Lord use parables? Why? Why couldn't he just teach directly? Why didn't he just give direct teaching? Then we'll get a little bit into interpretation. Well, there are a number of reasons, okay? So kind of our next thing then. And actually, we have indications in the scriptures as to exactly why he did that. But you would think if the information is that important, why not just say it directly, right? And there would be a good point there. Well, there was a reason why he did that, a very clear reason, right? Let's look at these things. This is going to be important, right? Number one, it was to generate attention. All right, teachers do this a lot. It's easy for us to understand this. So one is to generate attention. If you've done any kind of teaching at all or preaching at all, the humdrum plodding through the verses and all that sort of thing, to most people is kind of boring, unless you're bizarre like me and you happen to like that. It's kind of boring to people. But you throw an illustration in there and all of a sudden everybody wakes up. Okay, so if I were to just go through these notes, blah, 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 which I don't really like to do that, so I'd like to add some things to it. Why is that? To generate attention. Stories and illustrations are normally more fascinating and interesting to people. So a good teacher will try to get their attention by this. And so this could be one of the reasons why the Lord spoke in parables. When a speaker moves from an abstract truth to a concrete illustration, for most people, he's putting it at a level that's understandable. People like to hear stories that they can relate to, okay? And so this is why he did it. The Lord knows our nature. Realize that teaching without attention is no teaching at all. He wanted to get somebody's attention. So what he would do is he would talk about things and develop stories and situations that people were familiar with. Okay, the parable of the sower, for example. Would the people back then be familiar with sowing and reaping? Yeah. Does the Lord teach a lot about sowing and reaping? Well, he does. I mean, there's a spiritual application there. But people could relate to that. They've done it before, undoubtedly. What about fishing? Fishing with a net. Okay, the drag net. When he gave the parable of the drag net, especially those apostles, they knew exactly what he was talking about. They related to him completely. They understood it. It was fascinating to them. A woman kneading dough was a common thing, right? Kneading the dough, getting the leaven out, right? That's a very, very common thing. A woman sweeping her house, looking for the coin, right? Very common, especially when you have dirt floors. Growing a mustard seed, a shepherd losing a sheep, a father reuniting with a long-lost son, a marriage procession. These things were the teaching forums that the Lord used in his parables, and he did that on purpose so that people would understand that. Hiring people in a marketplace. There's a marketplace. People go, you look for jobs there, looking for a job. So they would go there and hire people. That was not unfamiliar to people then. Okay, so this enabled the Lord to channel his teaching to all people, or to something that was familiar. Again, the teaching was, and the Bible was written in a common language. The Lord taught to common people. Right? And we see the love of the Lord and his love to people that way. So the fact that he used a parable, number one, is to generate attention. Number two, and this is going to require a little bit of explanation, Mary, maybe, but to prevent repulsion, I'll put that word, by sudden truth. Okay, now what I mean by that is a lot of the times the things that the Lord was teaching there through the parable were things that had he said them directly, it would have repelled or repulsed those people listening to him, they would have shut him off. Okay, let me give and sometimes he did it on purpose. Okay, John chapter 6. In there, the Lord says, unless you eat my... Okay, now imagine sitting there, okay, you're listening to him speak, and he says, by the way, unless you eat my flesh and drink my blood, you have no part with me. Now you're listening to that. What? You expect us to be cannibals? So, and that would be gross, wouldn't it? Man, what are you talking about? I did that on purpose because he was trying to discern who would be there to listen to his teaching, who wouldn't. He says, you have no part of the Son of Man unless you do these things. And so a lot of the people said, this is a hard saying. They said, this is a hard saying. We can't accept it. What are they really saying there? It's ridiculous what he's saying. Can't accept those things. And so then it said that from that day forward, many of the disciples no longer walk with him. At that point, the Lord looked to his apostles and he said, will you also go away? And that's where Peter said, where are we going to go? You have the words of life. So what was Peter really saying there? He was really saying in a simplified way, although I can't understand what you just said, you are the Messiah. You are Lord. There must be truth in what you said. I can't understand it, but I accept that there is truth in that. And so he stayed to listen to it, and then it was given to them. And that's when the Lord said, he that hath ears to hear, let him hear. So the Lord was trying to discern there people that were there to maybe get fed by him or whatever, okay, from the people who would actually desire to listen to his teaching. So that's why he did that. Now, so in that instance, he did it on purpose. He said things on purpose to be sudden to them because he wanted to see if they'd still stay there. On the other hand, sometimes he said it in such a way so that they wouldn't be so antagonistic against it. So if the Lord would have come up, sometimes he did that, but if the Lord would have come up to the Pharisees and just said, all of you are white painted sepulchres, okay? Inside you're full of dead men's bones and all the rest of that. If he would have just said that right away, it would have repelled them. Now, at a certain point in his ministry, he did do that. But then sometimes he spoke to them in parables. And he said, and he made them answer their own condemnation. And then he gave them the interpretation of those things. Well, they stayed with him. A good one to understand this is when Nathan came and spoke to David, right? When he sinned with Bathsheba. What was Nathan's method there? Well, he came to him and he devised a situation where there was a sheep, right? And there was a traveler that came and he had to feed some friends that came over, and he had a big flock of sheep and all that, but instead of taking that, he took the one sheep from a poor man and dressed it for his friends instead of taking his own. So then David pronounced condemnation against that person, didn't he? That wicked man and so forth. And then he said, thou art the man, right? So that was a good example. Now, had Nathan maybe gone to King David and said, you're a rotten this and this and the other thing, King David would have probably said, I don't know. Who knows? We're kind of supposing. But because David had just pronounced his own condemnation, it was a little bit hard for him to deny that teaching at that point. So a too sudden revelation would have repelled some people, and so the Lord spoke in parables so that they would stay with him, and then he gave the interpretation, many times them condemning themselves. Okay. Right. So we talked about that, yep. Okay, number 3 then. Or C in this case. To stimulate inquiry. Admittedly, this kind of goes with A little bit. But those who comprehended that there was truth beyond the earthly story were stirred to search out and seek after the heavenly truth. Matthew 13:12, which I think this is your memory verse, I think. For whosoever hath, to him shall be given, and he shall have more abundance, but whosoever hath not, from him shall be taken away even that he hath. All right, so this idea of stimulating inquiry, is stimulating this, what are you talking about? Okay, what am I having? What am I not having? People that would want to know would be stimulated there to seek for truth within what the parable was talking about. Okay, and then D, and I kind of talked about this from John chapter 6, but D is to test the character of his hearers. He wanted to see if they would stay and listen to him, even though they may not have understood what he was saying. So, parables were designed to impress indelibly upon the memory of his hearers truths, perhaps as yet not fully intelligible or understandable, but which would grow clear as the divine life was formed within them. That's a fancy way of saying this, simply that they may not have understood it right away. And there were some spiritual truths that they would not have understood. The idea of God's Spirit dwelling inside somebody and that regenerate life, which would be the kingdom of God, is not something that to a Jewish mind they would have understood right away. It took some time for them to understand that. So the Lord talked about oil. He talked about fire, these things that would be inside, okay, that from which the fire is lit, to help them to understand what the spiritual life walking in the Spirit would be like. So there's a good example of a parable. So this really depended upon the receptiveness of the hearers. To the extent that they hungered for spiritual understanding, they would have stayed and understood it. This is why the Lord said to those that have ears to hear, let them hear. Obviously, every one of them had ears to hear. He wasn't talking about the physical, nerve endings inside his ear. He was talking about the people that really want to know and to understand these things. Let them hear. Let them understand. He also says in some other parts of the Gospels, unto you is committed. Okay, unto you is committed to know these things, because you're the ones that stayed and would want to know and wish to know it. So through a parable, there would be some people there who would say, okay, I'm going to use common vernacular. Look, we just came here to get fed. Okay, I don't know about this story he's talking about. Okay, I just came here to see a miracle from him. I don't know what the story he's talking about. Okay, this is the idea. Well, those are not the kind of people that he came to seek and to save those who were lost. So to discern these things, not to mention in the history of the Lord's ministry there, they wanted to make him king. They wanted to force him to be king. You remember, they were going to take him and make him forcibly become a king. Well, he had to go to the cross first. And so to prevent all of these things, he would sometimes speak in parables. It kind of helped out there. Okay, so parables revealed sacred truths to some and veiled them from others. Whoever wanted to know would know, and whoever didn't, well, then was free to go. All right, very good. Now, thirdly, let's talk about the interpretation of parables. All right, number 3. And interpretation of parables. Okay, number 1. Every parable is told for the enforcement of one main truth. That doesn't mean that there aren't other truths, but there's one main truth. So discerning what that one main truth is really a big key to interpreting the parable. Okay? What's he trying to get across here? So, if that's true, then we should seek to figure out what that main truth is instead of trying to allegorizing everything and getting way off. So this keeps us focused. Right? So there is one main truth. A lot of times that main truth is what the Lord is trying to teach because of events that were going on around him. Okay? But there's one main truth. He's trying to get something across. This main truth is determined in lots of different ways. Okay, this is going to be important also because this is what you're going to do in your projects and things. That one main truth is determined in several ways. Sometimes the manner in which the parable is introduced. Okay, I've kind of already mentioned that, but let me give you an example. There was a lawyer that came to the Lord and said, what did he say? He says, "Who is my neighbor?" There was a question. So that lawyer had broached the subject of a neighbor to the Lord. In response to that question, he gives the parable of the Good Samaritan. So what was the thing that initiated that parable? Who is my neighbor? So what's the main truth that Christ is trying to get across? He's trying to get across who his neighbor is. So we don't want to forget that as we muddle through all of the details. Okay, you've got a Levite, you've got a priest, you've got a guy that's beat up, you've got a person with a donkey, and he's a Samaritan and all that. Okay, so if we start allegorizing that, we get way off. Okay, what's he trying to do? He's answering the question, who is my neighbor? So the manner sometimes in which the parable is introduced. Secondly, the main truth is determined through the circumstances in which it was delivered. This would be the framework, okay, the immediate context there. Again, the example of the Good Samaritan is a good one, but there were others. Sometimes it said he told this parable to those who trusted in themselves. Okay, so what's the main truth there? To show people that trust in themselves. It's not really that difficult to come up with the main truth. A lot of times it's couched in the context of the parable. What happened right before? That kind of thing. The purpose is often indicated in the very first words. Right? Sometimes you know that truth because it's said. For example, the kingdom of heaven is like. All right, so what's the one main truth there? He's trying to teach us what the kingdom of heaven is like. So then he'll give a parable. Dragnet, whatever. Okay, so that central truth or main idea sometimes is supplied by the Lord himself. He'll say it. Sometimes the writer will give that central truth. He will give that understanding. And sometimes the Lord will say it. Sometimes the person writing it will say it. At any rate, somewhere inside there, we can come up with what that main truth is. All right, so that's the first thing, interpretation, that one main truth. Secondly, beware making parables a key source of doctrine. Okay. Oh, sorry. So there's one main truth. Number two, parables themselves are not necessarily a key, and I underline that, source of doctrine. Okay, in other words, are parables doctrinal in nature? In nature. I'm not saying they don't teach doctrine, but are they doctrinal in nature? Not really. I mean, they're not really giving a teaching. You're telling a story here. There are teachings, but we don't establish doctrine here. The key law of Bible study is to go from literal to figurative, from clear to the more obscure, and not the other way around. Okay? So we interpret the more obscure things by the things that are clear. Okay? We don't interpret the clear things by the things that are obscure. Understand that? So by nature, a parable gives an example of things. It's not a direct thing. So we don't want to make it a source of doctrinal truth, but instead we want to make sure that we keep the very clear teaching of doctrine first. Now, there were people in history that broke that rule. In other words, they began to make a parable the main source of truth. And so that coupled with the fact that they would allegorize, they got way off. Okay, the Gnostic heresy in the first century was a big peril, you could say, to Christianity during that time because they used allegory and they interpreted parables according to the allegorical approach and used it as a main source of truth. They majored, you could say, on the minors. And so they used these parables and the obscurity therein to infiltrate the people with their false doctrine. You follow what I'm saying there? So any kind of thing that is obscure, a gray area, that's a lot of times what Satan will use to try to get people off. Okay? So that's why we have to remember, we don't use parables. Now, it's going to support sometimes doctrinal teaching, but it's not the main source. Okay. Okay. Let me give you an example now. Where can we go then if and then we got one more thing. Parables and not a secret. Okay, so how do I want to say this? Number 3, don't get off the path, in case, or the path of the main truth, you could say. Keep this in mind. All right, let me give you an example of what somebody did one time with the parable of the Good Samaritan. So he allegorized it. Okay, here we go. What's the main teaching there? What's the question he's trying to answer? Who is my? He's my neighbor. Okay, so one person interpreted the Good Samaritan like this. The men who fell among the thieves, that's Adam. It's clear, his name was Adam. It's Adam. The thieves, what do they represent? What's the devil and his angels, obviously. The priest and the Levite, what do they represent? The Mosaic dispensation, the law. The Good Samaritan, what does he represent? Christ. The oil. What about the oil and the wine that he used to cure him? Oh yes. The comforts and blessings of the gospel. Isn't that wonderful? What about the beast that he put the person on? This is the humanity of Christ. It symbolizes Christ's humanity. Right? You with me? The setting the wounded man on the beast, that's the substitutionary salvation. What is the end? That's the church. And the 2 pence that he gave is the life that is now and that which is to come. 2 pence. Isn't that wonderful? Meanwhile, so who is my neighbor then? You see the point? You can get way off. I'm going to make sure you don't do that. All right, and then it can be somewhat comical, but in truth, throughout history, again, these heretics have used this ambiguity to teach their false doctrine. One more thing, we'll be done. You have to bring a spiritual character and teaching, spiritual teaching. Because it's a parable, we talked about that. Bring the spiritual teachings. Bring spiritual teaching. I'll say to light. All right. Make sure that you make that step there. Okay, if we're to get any kind of truth out of it, it has to be spiritual. The wisdom and teachability comes from the source of both, Christ himself, and then humility of mind is vital to reception of this biblical truth. Allegory tends to be high-minded kind of thing, right? We make this connection with things, but the truth of the matter is, Christ was teaching the common people, and he's trying to get a main truth across, and we have to keep that in mind. So as we go through these parables, you'll see what we're talking about, hopefully, and you'll show it yourself.